ABC News and Public Affairs presents now a playback of this morning's Landon Lecture, featuring former U.S. Senator J. William Fulbright of Arkansas. Senator Fulbright was a 32-year veteran of the U.S. Senate, 16 years of that as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He was a lecturer in the distinguished series of Landon Lectures, and he spoke this morning in KSU Auditorium. Senator Fulbright.
It is a great privilege to be invited back for a second time to this campus. I always think the first time is probably inspired by curiosity, and the second time, I would hope, by the sentiments so well and eloquently expressed by President McCain. It's been just 8 years since my last visit, and I'm very pleased, too, to find that the leading citizen of Kansas is still in such good health, so vigorous, good spirits as Governor Landon. He is one of those very unusual people who sometimes appear in public office. That is, a man with uncommon common sense. And his views about the tragedy in Vietnam, which were referred to by President McCain, was really the principal reason why I came here 8 years ago, which was at the height of that particular political problem. And I was very pleased, certainly at that time, at the attitude which the governor took, and I am, of course, very honored to be invited to give this 29th lecture in this series. Before beginning my lecture, I'd like to say just what I would call a personal word. A great many commentators in recent days have been saying that as a result of the recent developments in our government, that the younger generation, which is represented so well here, is becoming disillusioned with our political system. As President McCain has just told you, I've just completed 32 years in the Congress, and I wish to suggest to you that you not be disillusioned, or as some of the commentators have said, turned off about our system, but that you undertake to make it work as it was designed to work by our founding fathers, and did actually work so well during such a long period. It is a good system, in my opinion. It is the only one that you have, after all, and your future, whether you like it or not, is bound up with it. And I think you can make it work by careful attention to whom you select to represent you. And I must say, I think your recent selection, with whom I had breakfast this morning, is a good example of that. She struck me as a most able and promising new member of the Congress, and it also reminded me that the British have just selected, at least the Conservative Party in Britain, just selected an outstanding woman in their parliament as the leader of that party, which, if things follow the usual traditional pattern, will make her prime minister sometime. But if you continue, and if you are selective in these decisions, and if you use discriminating judgment about important public issues, that would ensure the effective operation of the system. I do not think, while it's difficult, that it's impossible. The very fact that this system is still functioning after all that has happened to undermine it during these last 10 years is in itself proof that it does have vitality, that it is a tough system, and that it should be nourished and not abandoned. Well, I felt that 32 years would entitle me to give advice on that subject, at least. Now, as to the present lecture, I have entitled it Energy in the Middle East, Interests and Illusions. There is a profoundly important difference between our current deep involvement in the Middle East and our lingering half-involvement in the wars of Southeast Asia. The difference is that American interests are at stake in the Middle East. That is, access to oil, the survival of Israel, and the avoidance of conflict with the Soviet Union, making our involvement important, if not indeed inevitable. In Vietnam and Cambodia, by contrast, nothing of surpassing consequence for the United States is or ever was at stake. And for that simple but compelling reason, our involvement has been and remains a mistake, a tragic mistake, rooted in illusions about our national interest. The term national interest is an imprecise one, and it begs the question to invoke it as a guide to policy unless we have a fairly clear conception of what an interest is and what it is not. I would suggest the following distinctions. A vital interest is anything which pertains directly to our national survival, or short of that, something materially and discernibly pertinent to the security and well-being of the American people. Most of us would agree that the avoidance of nuclear war, which is the object of détente with the communist powers, the NATO alliance and alliance with Japan, and access to oil and other essential resources belonging in this category. I personally would put the development and the strengthening of the United Nations in the vital category at the top of the list, but I'm painfully aware of being in the minority on this matter. We also have interests which are less than vital, not really matters of life and death for our society, but matters of strong preference to many or most Americans, whether for reasons of idealism, humanitarianism, or ethnic or religious affiliation. I would place in this category such objectives as the development of India, democracy in Latin America, and the survival and prosperity of Israel. The distinguishing characteristic of these goals is that they are things which we want very much and would make certain sacrifices for, but which are necessarily secondary to our vital interests. Although there may be gradations on the way, we come at last to the category of illusions or infatuations about the national interest, or if you like, the arrogance of power. Here we are dealing with matters of national prestige, imperial presumption, or the vanity of leaders who do not care to admit that they have made a mistake. The distinguishing characteristics of our many national enterprises of this kind are that they usually involve great cost, great risk, and no discernible benefits to the American people. Honorable mention in this category goes to the $30 billion we might have spent on energy research in the 1960s, but instead spent to put a man on the moon, so as to avoid the horrible disgrace of letting the Russians get there first. Even more honorable mention goes to our gigantic defense expenditures for exotic and unnecessary weapons, such as the F-111 bomber, which fell out of the sky so often, the C-5A transport, which only within a few days I noticed Mr. Schlesinger, the defense secretary, says he needs $900 million to give it wings that won't fall off, and the Trident nuclear submarine, or most recently something called a cannon-launched guided projectile, an artillery shell whose course can be changed in mid-flight like a guided missile. Like politicians experimenting with ideas in their speeches, as we all do, the military experiment with weapons systems, not because we need them for our defense, but just to see if they'll work. The difference, of course, is the cost. The politician's oratory may be superfluous, but it is usually provided free of charge, or at least at a very moderate price. But missiles and bombers may be equally superfluous, but at a cost of billions, of tens of billions of dollars. The gold star in this category of foreign policy illusions goes, of course, to the war in Indochina. It is not my purpose here to revive the old arguments about Vietnam, but only to point out that there is no more justification for our continuing heavy expenditures to sustain the regimes in South Vietnam and Cambodia than there was for our own direct military involvement. Our security is not threatened. There are no essential resources involved, and the cost is exorbitant. And from a humanitarian viewpoint, it is exceedingly cruel and heartless, I think, to subject the Indo-Chinese people to endless civil war, perpetuated by our military assistance. Nonetheless, despite high unemployment, still rampant inflation, and gigantic budget deficits here at home, The Ford administration is asking Congress for sizable new and additional military appropriations for Indochina this year, including $300 million in emergency assistance for South Vietnam and $222 million for Cambodia, and a projected $1.3 billion of military aid to South Vietnam for the fiscal year 1976. Congress, in my opinion, would be well advised to reject these requests for reasons of compelling national interest. I make these observations by way of preface to my major theme for today, which is the Middle East. The point to be borne in mind is that our foreign policy cannot be based across the board on general principles of involvement or non-involvement, of idealism or realpolitik. The guiding principle must be the national interest in its various gradations and components, and in the way these relate to each other. The American people do not engage their public servants to conduct foreign crusades or adventures, even idealistic adventures, but rather to advance their own security and their own welfare. In a report of some years ago, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee noted that foreign policy is not an end in itself. We do not have a foreign policy because it is interesting, or because it's fun, or because it satisfies some basic human need. We conduct foreign policy for a purpose external to itself, that is, the purpose of securing democratic values to the people of our own country. There's nothing illusory about our interest in the Middle East, but we do suffer from certain illusions about the character of our interest there and the way in which they relate to each other. The catalyst, if not the cause of our current mounting difficulties, was the Middle East War of 1973. Like the assassination of Sarajevo in 1914, the October War set loose a chain reaction of events. The war precipitated the oil embargo, and the embargo combined with Arab military successes gave the Arabs a whole new sense of their own power and capacity. The oil-producing countries, non-Arab as well as Arab, became suddenly and belatedly aware of the power they held in their hands. United in the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they set out to redress the imbalance between cheap oil and costly imports, and also, and very importantly, I think, in a psychological sense, to redress centuries of colonialism and exploitation. They did this through huge and precipitous increases in the price of oil. In the long run, as the finite supply of fossil fuels in the world runs down, the price of oil was bound to rise anyway. It is true, too, that until 1973, oil was artificially low in price owing to unbalanced terms of trade between raw materials and manufactured products. And it is also true that oil price increases are by no means the sole cause of current high inflation rates in the industrial countries. Nevertheless, the suddenness and the extent of the oil price increases, more than fourfold in a single year, have had a devastating effect upon the economies of the consumer countries, especially in their international payments. In 1974, the United States had a trade deficit of $3.07 billion, the second largest deficit of this century. But if oil imports had cost the same as in 1973, we would have had a trade surplus of $14 billion. Gives you some estimate of the seriousness of it. The World Bank estimates that by 1980, the oil-producing countries will hold $600 billion in unused monetary reserves. If producer country imports continue at their currently unexpectedly high level, the imbalance will be reduced, it is true, but not sufficiently to eliminate the threat of the collapse of the world monetary system. If that is to be prevented, a great deal more will have to be done. First and most urgently, we must take steps to save the international monetary system. That means that ways must be devised to keep the money which is flowing into the oil-producing countries flowing back as well, which is to say it must be recycled. That is the first requirement, regardless of what else is done now or later to bring down the price of oil. The most populous oil-producing countries, Iran, Venezuela, Nigeria, and Indonesia, are already recycling most of their earnings by spending them on foreign goods and machinery for their national development programs. Some, too, especially Iran, are spending large amounts of money on foreign arms. Though unevenly distributed, money spent for foreign manufactured products enables the recipients of these funds to finance their oil imports. The problem arises with respect to the underpopulated oil producers, that is, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Libya, and the United Arab Emirates. With their small populations, there's only so much these countries can usefully buy from abroad, with the result that huge money surpluses accumulate and are in effect put out of circulation. With no way to earn their money back, the industrial countries are threatened with international bankruptcy and domestic depression. To correct this dangerous imbalance, I would propose that urgent steps be taken both by government and by private groups to induce large-scale, long-term oil country investment in the United States and other oil-importing countries. Just putting their money in our banks as demand deposits does no good. The money can be taken out at any time and is therefore unavailable for income-producing investments. Perhaps a high-level committee of private citizens who are expert in banking and investment and who also have the confidence of the oil-exporting countries could be formed to advise and assist these countries in channeling their funds into safe, profitable, and productive long-term investments in the importing countries. At present, there is widespread fear of Arab takeovers of our industries if we allow them to invest heavily. Aside from the ill grace of such complaints coming after 2 decades of heavy American investment in European industries and in natural resources all around the world, the fear of Arab investment is rooted in both prejudice and unspoken political assumptions. The prejudice is against the Arabs as people. It is the old stereotype of the Arab as not quite civilized desert raiders who ought not to be trusted, like Europeans with serious responsibilities such as the management of money. The unspoken political assumption which one detects in the atmosphere is that extensive new economic ties with the Arab countries will undercut our commitment to Israel, all the more if these ties are in fact mutually rewarding. For these reasons, we are urged against initiatives which are clearly in the national interest. We are urged to erect obstacles to the inflow of funds which we badly need to overcome our foreign payments deficits. The prejudice against the Arabs is as ignorant as it is cruel. Americans who have done business in the Arab world almost always find their counterparts cordial, knowledgeable, and reliable. The connection of Arab investment with our commitment to Israel points up 2 facts. First, that the issues are indeed connected and must be dealt with in relation to each other. Second, that when 2 national interests seem to conflict, the task of leadership is to reconcile them, not to pretend that the conflict does not exist or to devise rationalizations for sacrificing the greater interest to the lesser. In addition to recycling, we must conserve energy. Conservation will not only lower our total oil bill, it may induce lower prices by lowering overall demand in relation to the supply. And for reasons to which I will return, energy conservation may be a boon to the quality of life in our society. The amount and means by which we shall have to cut back our oil imports is currently in hot debate. At present, we consume approximately 17 million barrels of oil a day, of which about 7 million barrels are imported. The administration says we must reduce imports by 2 million barrels a day by the end of 1977. Others say the cutback must be much greater, on our part and also on the part of other oil importing countries. if overall demand is to be reduced sufficiently to bring about a lowering of prices. Still others contend that with discoveries of oil in the North Sea, Alaska, and off our east coast, there will be soon a glut on the world market, which will knock prices down, and that therefore the current alarm is unwarranted. Nor is there any more consensus as to the means of cutting imports and consumption. The administration proposes a program of tariffs combined with the decontrol of our domestic oil and natural gas prices. Some members of Congress deplore this approach as inflationary, preferring import quotas and either a stiff increase in gasoline prices or outright gasoline rationing. At the same time, the unemployment of 8.2%, the highest since the end of the Great Depression in 1941, certain reputable economists are contending that we should postpone any cutbacks in oil imports and consumption lest we further deepen the already deep recession. With these observations, I hope that I've clarified for you exactly what must be done to solve the energy crisis and the recession. This is what we often find in Washington. More likely, I have merely added to your confusion, in which event you've joined company with our leaders and with the experts. You know, the trouble with economics, so appropriately termed the dismal science, is that it is replete with propositions which, though equally plausible, are quite contradictory. I do not wish to be unduly alarmist or pessimistic, but one gets a picture these days of a government and of experts in confusion and conflict with one another. It would seem almost as if the Marxian prediction of breakdown resulting from the contradictions of capitalism were about to become a reality. Mr. Brezhnev himself said in a speech last fall that inflation and economic crisis were speeding up the disintegration of the political machinery of capitalist rule, and that this indeed was unavoidable because it stemmed from the very nature of capitalism. My own belief is that things are bad, but not that bad. I feel reasonably hopeful that through tax cuts and other means of pump priming, we will gradually pull out of the current recession, although probably at the cost of rekindling some inflation. I also believe that we should not allow either the recession or the prospect of new oil strikes to deter us from a stringent program of energy conservation. I have no great objection to the President's proposal for reducing imports through tariffs, although the same result, it seems to me, could be achieved quickly and effectively by import quotas. Similarly, I think that the decontrol of domestic oil and natural gas prices makes long-term economic sense if we are to bring demand into balance with supply and also create incentive for new exploration and drilling. We must also proceed with a carefully balanced but sizable national program for the development of new energy sources. This would include offshore oil drilling, with all possible care being taken to prevent pollution of the sea, and the development of improved technologies for mining coal and for the liquefaction and gasification of coal at manageable cost. This apparently has been done quite successfully in South Africa, and it puzzles me no end that we have neglected it because they use some of our processes in doing it. We must also proceed with research and development of the exotic new energy possibilities, including nuclear fusion and solar and geothermal energy. All of these have possibilities, but not in the immediate future. To encourage this, it will be necessary, despite our desire to bring oil prices down, to keep them from coming down too much. The reason for this is that if oil prices were to drop, say, to their 1973 level, we would lose our incentive to conserve, while industry would lose its incentive to invest in the new energy sources which we're absolutely certain to need within the next decade or so. To deal with this problem, Secretary Kissinger has suggested that the major oil importers agree to use tariffs or other means to maintain a common floor price on oil imports considerably lower, would hope, than the current price, but high enough to encourage the development of alternate energy sources. Devising the best means of conservation at home requires us to go beyond immediate economic considerations. and take into account the long-term necessities of our society and our environment. I would suggest, therefore, that we focus our conservation measures in that most energy wasteful, environmentally destructive, and socially obsolete feature of American life, the heavy, overpowered private automobile. Here on the broad plains of Kansas, the pressures of overcrowding and urban pollution may seem remote, but they are real and pressing in the great urban centers, especially on the East Coast. At the same time, we have come into a period, at least for the next decade or so, of costly energy. Both of these factors combine to make the big private automobile a kind of a dinosaur in modern America. In our urban areas, we're going to have to rely increasingly on mass public transport, and both in and out of the cities, we're going to have to trade in our big limousines and sport cars for smaller, lighter vehicles, which can go at least 25 or 30 miles a gallon or more, hopefully. To encourage this, I suggest an excise tax on new automobiles steeply graduated according to fuel efficiency, a legally imposed limit on automobile horsepower, and an increase in the federal gasoline tax of whatever amount is necessary to curb consumption substantially, with a system of rebates for individuals whose livelihoods depend upon their cars or trucks or tractors. As I suggested earlier, energy conservation could bring unexpected benefits to our society and lifestyle. With our current energy-intensive lifestyle, we Americans are not only living beyond our economic means, we're living beyond our environmental means as well, depleting not only the world's fossil fuels, but also many other non-renewable raw materials of all kinds. We're also consuming renewable resources such as fish faster than the Earth's natural processes can replace them, and we're fouling the rivers and oceans beyond their natural capacity for cleansing themselves. We have fallen into what may be called a technological illusion about the good life. The more machines and gadgets we possess, and the more energy we therefore consume, the better we think our lives are, as if living affluently were the same as living well. In fact, they're not the same. Living well requires a certain harmony with nature, a sense of pace about time, the taking of pleasure in simple things, such as the view of a mountain or the sea or the plains on a fine day, and the company of family and friends and fellow students. The average American today consumes twice the energy he consumed 30 years ago, twice as much as is now consumed by a European, and perhaps 50 times as much energy as a Chinese. Think of it. Do you suppose for a moment that the average American is now twice as happy as he used to be? Or twice as happy as the average German or Frenchman? Or 50 times as happy as a Chinese farmer? There is certainly no visible relationship between our greatly increased energy consumption of recent years and, say, the quality of our architecture or of our literature or of urban life in general. The thought arises that such improvements in our civilization might be encouraged by diminished energy consumption. The philosopher and microbiologist René Dubos suggests that intensive use of industrial energy frees us of the necessity to make creative and adaptive responses to environmental challenges. It makes for an easier life, he writes, but it impoverishes our experience. It may be, therefore, that the end or interruption of the age of cheap energy may give us incentive to redirect our creative powers from growth and gadgetry to a renewed concern with the quality of life and of culture and the environment, freeing us from the illusion that technology is progress. There is another significant aspect to the energy crisis, and that is its close relationship to the Arab-Israel conflict. Our efforts to deal with both have been blunted, in large part, indeed thwarted, by the illusion or pretense that they have nothing to do with each other. In fact, as I suggested earlier, they have a great deal to do with each other, not only because the oil prices revolution was precipitated by the War of October 1973, but because the principal Arab oil producers, notably Saudi Arabia, perceive and act upon two issues, oil and Israel, in relation to each other. As I have suggested earlier, I believe that access to oil is the greater of our interests in the Middle East, a vital interest, whereas our commitment to Israel is a less than vital interest. I believe, too, that the all-out supporters of current Israeli policy in Congress and elsewhere are well aware of this priority of interest, and precisely because they do recognize it, contend that the two issues are unrelated. Only by denying the connection can supportive Israeli policy be given priority over our national energy requirements. The issue is further obfuscated by the invocation of idealism on Israel's behalf. To this, I would suggest that there are other ideals involved besides Israel's democracy and vitality, impressive though these are, including the ideal of self-determination for the Palestinian people. But even more, I would stress again that our government is not an eleemosynary institution. Its first obligation is to the security and the welfare of the American people, not perhaps to the extent of exclusiveness, but certainly to the extent of primacy. In practice, I do not believe it is necessary to sacrifice is to the security and the welfare of the American people, not perhaps to the extent of exclusiveness, but certainly to the extent of primacy. In practice, I do not believe it is necessary to sacrifice oil to Israel or Israel to oil. Indeed, I believe it to be perfectly feasible to achieve both an equitable settlement which will assure the survival and security of Israel, and also solidify our good political and economic relations with the Arab countries. In order to do this, however, it is necessary to appreciate the convergence of the two issues, oil and Israel, and also to appreciate the central importance of Saudi Arabia in this linkage. Within the organization, OPEC countries as they're called, the countries most insistent on repeated price increases have not been the Arab states, but two of the principal non-Arab producers, that is, Iran and Venezuela. The largest oil exporter with the largest reserves, Saudi Arabia, has shown a keen awareness of the dangerous disruptions threatened by the 4 to 5-fold increase in the price of oil. And Saudi officials have made known, both publicly and privately in unmistakable terms, their strong desire to lower prices and to work out long-term supply arrangements for the industrial nations, especially the United States. The Saudis are motivated by strong feelings of friendship and also of reliance upon the United States. Greatly fearing communism and Soviet and Chinese influence in the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia looks to the United States as its mainstay against communism in the Middle East. But the Saudis are caught in a dilemma. It is exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, for them to accommodate the United States while the United States provides the money and arms which enables Israel to occupy Arab lands. Further, and this is the heart of the matter, King Faisal feels a special responsibility, indeed a stewardship, for the holy places of Islam. Second only to Mecca in sanctity to Muslims is Jerusalem, where the Dome of the Rock is located, scarcely 100 yards from the Wailing Wall, which is Judaism's holiest site, and within a half mile of the Christian shrine, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. As a city sacred to three religions, Jerusalem warrants a special status. Exactly what the status is less important than that it be acceptable to all parties. It might be feasible to repartition the city along the old Arab sector and the new Israeli city as before 1967, but providing for free access to all the religious shrines and perhaps redrawing the boundary to include the Wailing Wall within the Jewish sector. Or, as has often been suggested, Jerusalem could be internationalized, that is, be given a special status in accordance with the original United Nations partition plan or resolution of 1947. Equally as important as Jerusalem for a just and durable settlement is the provision for self-determination by the Palestinian people. Forcibly expelled from their homes and country and subjected for over a quarter of a century to the harsh privation of refugee camps, the Palestinian people are deserving of restitution just as the Jewish people were deserving of restitution after World War II. They have as much right to a homeland as do the Jewish people, and they have shown, moreover, that they can and will persist in their guerrilla warfare until they get one. Accordingly, a reasonable settlement must allow of a Palestinian state being established in the territories now occupied by Israel on the west bank of the Jordan River and the Gaza Strip. Alternately, the Palestinians might form a confederation with the Kingdom of Jordan, but the choice should be theirs, and by all current indications, that would not be their choice. Far from selling out Israel, a settlement based on Israeli withdrawal to the approximate borders of 1967, along with explicit great power guarantees, would call upon Israel to do nothing more than she ought to do anyway, even if there were not a drop of oil in the Middle East. Indeed, it would be to Israel's advantage, probably her salvation, in my opinion, because there can be no lasting security for that small and beleaguered community without an overall political settlement. And there can be no settlement of that kind without withdrawal. For the United States, the occasion, if we rise to it, is one of those rare and happy ones in which justice and self-interest coincide. 5 years ago, in a remarkable but little noted article, the president of the World Jewish Congress, Dr. Nahum Goldman, raised the question of whether an Israel armed to the teeth and repeatedly at war could fulfill the Zionist ideal of a homeland for Jewish culture and religion, noting, too, that the long-term balance of power would inevitably swing to the Arabs with their vastly greater numbers, their growing oil wealth, and their technological capacity. Dr. Goldman concluded that Israel should seek to become a neutralized state, somewhat like Switzerland, guaranteed by the nations of the world, including the Arab nations. I was always a political Zionist, Dr. Goldman wrote at that time, in the sense that I believe that Jews must have a state of their own to secure their identity and civilization. More and more, however, I am coming to the conclusion that Israel cannot be one of the more than 100 so-called sovereign national states as they exist today, and that instead of relying primarily and exclusively on its military and political strength, it should be not merely accepted, but guaranteed de jure and de facto by all the people of the world, including the Arabs, and put under the permanent protection of the whole of mankind. We may ask, is such an arrangement remotely feasible from the Arab point of view? Whoever knows the Arabs, Dr. Goldman also wrote, their history and character, agrees that pride is one of their most excessive virtues. But an appeal to the generosity of the Arabs to be guarantors with the rest of the world for a Jewish state in a tiny part of the tremendous territories at their disposal, however unrealistic it may sound at the moment, may be more effective in the long run for an Arab-Israeli coexistence than one Israeli victory after another. How, as a practical matter, should America and other statesmen proceed toward the achievement of so desirable an arrangement? I would suggest two essential changes of approach. We must accept the Russians as full partners in the making and guarantee of a Middle East peace, and the Israelis must accept the Palestinians, represented by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, as negotiating partners with the right to form a state of their own. Although Secretary Kissinger has made admirable progress with his disengagement agreements and may on this current trip secure another Sinai disengagement, there are limits to the progress that can be made through the step-by-step approach. Welcome and impressive as the withdrawals in Sinai and the Golan Heights have been, they do not deal with the central, crucial issues of Jerusalem and the West Bank. As the noted Egyptian journalist Mohammed Heikel notes, this is a policy of pacification rather than of seeking a solution, and it is insufficient because we cannot pacify forever. Nor can the Soviets be expected to acquiesce in a process or a settlement from which they have been excluded. If and when peace is finally made, the guarantee of the Soviet Union will be hardly less important than our own. One hopes that American diplomats will not succumb once again to what Mr. Heikel calls their hunter's instinct, the old geopolitical impulse to expel Soviet influence from the Middle East while detaching Egypt from the other Arab countries. We should therefore proceed as quickly as possible after Mr. Kissinger's current mission to convene the Geneva Conference under the co-chairmanship of the Soviet Union and the United States, and to negotiate through that forum a general settlement based on Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 borders, self-determination of the Palestinian people, and a special status for Jerusalem, all under the guarantee of the great powers as members of the Security Council of the United Nations. I would also hope that consideration might be given to Dr. Goldman's proposal for a neutralized Israel. And as I have suggested on numerous occasions for the last 5 years, I would think it appropriate for the United States to reinforce the general guarantee of Israel with an explicit bilateral American guarantee through a treaty ratified by the Senate. Through these means, we can, I believe, reconcile our three major interests in the Middle East: access to oil, the security of Israel, and the avoidance of confrontation with the Soviet Union. An Arab-Israel settlement will not solve our energy crisis or assure the reduction of oil prices. It will, however, eliminate the major irritant in relations between the United States and the Arab states, especially Saudi Arabia, and in so doing create a much improved environment for negotiations on oil supply and prices. A settlement making just provision for the old city of Jerusalem and for the other occupied territories would greatly increase the political influence of Saudi Arabia, and therefore its weight as a force for moderation within OPEC. Saudi Arabia would be liberated, in effect, to do what King Faisal and his ministers want very much to do. That is, to cooperate to keep the West, and especially the United States, on which Saudi Arabia relies, prosperous and strong. There is not now, nor has there ever been, any basic incompatibility about our interests in the Middle East. Our difficulty in reconciling them has been the result of our own illusions about the priority of those interests in relation to each other. These illusions, of course, are not entirely accidental. They have been fostered and promoted by ardent and skillful lobbying. Of late, I note with satisfaction some serious reassessment seems to have been taking place. The new chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Sparkman of Alabama, recently expressed his support for a Palestinian state and for a settlement guaranteed by the Soviet Union and the United States in cooperation with the United Nations Security Council. Similarly, Senator Percy of Illinois, a sincere and long-time friend of Israel, gained a new impression of the Palestinians in the course of a recent visit to the Middle East, stating upon his return that the PLO leader, Mr. Arafat, is relatively speaking a moderate. Senator Percy also advocated Israel's withdrawal to the approximate borders of 1967 and suggested most sensibly that we cannot support Israel indiscriminately. Interests, it appears, are being recognized and illusions dispelled. Slowly and belatedly, to be sure, but that is the way of statecraft. Common sense, as Voltaire noted, is not so common. By contrast with our prodigies of technology, we do not seem to advance very quickly when it comes to the running of nations, the reconciling of interests, or the sensible conduct in general of human affairs. But we do sometimes manage it, and in that we can take hope. As Dr. Johnson said of the dog walking on his hind legs, it is not done well, but you're surprised to find it done at all. Thank you very much.
Senator Fulbright.